So if you put a program in 10 years ago, I bet your risk have changed because you're doing business differently. Just think of COVID. Think of something as simple as working from home. That's a different level of risk, not more or less, just different. And then, of course, remote work or return to the office. All of those have different risk implications. So as your risks change, you need to adapt your compliance program to whatever your risks are.
There are opportunities for our work and careers everywhere, if you know where to look. That's easier said than done, especially in our fast-paced and constantly changing world. Mary Ann Faremouth is talking to experts, employers, and job seekers to bring you insight and understanding about what's possible. This is Career Can Do, where we're navigating the new work world.
Welcome to the Career Can Do podcast, a top global podcast dedicated to helping you navigate the new work world and beyond. My name is Mary Ann Faremouth. I'll be the host for this episode, and today I am just delighted to have a guest on my show that I have the highest respect and admiration for. And it's because of this person that my own podcast, Career Can Do, was created. Tom Fox is the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network. Over the past 15 years, he has been a general counsel and chief compliance officer. He's now an independent consultant assisting companies with anti-corruption, anti-bribery, compliance, and international transaction issues. He specializes in bringing business solutions to compliance problems. Tom is also an author of the best-selling book, Lessons Learned on Compliance and Ethics. And his podcasts have won numerous awards, namely JD Communicator and the Webby Awards for podcasting excellence. So after that incredibly long introduction, without further ado, help me welcome Tom Fox. Tom, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Tom, it's just a delight to have you here. And as I mentioned, I'm so grateful to you because our meeting way back when in early 2020 is the reason I have Career Can Do. And I just think the world of Tom. I've worked a lot with him since that time. And he's just a super professional, a sharp guy, a wonderful person, and got a lot of good information to share with our listeners. So, Tom, tell us how you became the voice of compliance and the compliance evangelist.
Sure, Mary Ann. So since about 2010, I've practiced law in the arena of legal and regulatory compliance, specifically anti-corruption compliance. World loses $3 trillion annually to the scourge of bribery and corruption. And what I found was I was very passionate about fighting that scourge, but I could do so within the context of corporate America and corporations. And I could help corporations put compliance programs in place to prevent bribery and corruption. The direct result was they didn't violate the law, but the byproduct was it also, in my mind, helped fight that international scourge. And so I view compliance as the good news for business because I see effective compliance as more efficient business processes leading to greater ROI and profitability. So that's why I sort of self-anointed myself the compliance evangelist, because I think compliance is the good news. I became the voice of compliance in 2017 when I founded the Compliance Podcast Network, the only network dedicated to legal and regulatory compliance. Since that time, the network has grown to about 60 shows. Your show is one of those. It is slicing and dicing compliance in really all aspects of the employment experience in as many ways as we can do so. So I try to give as much information to compliance professionals, other business executives, legal types, both in-house and in private practice, as I can through the podcast format. And as you mentioned, I'm an author. In June, I had my 30th book published in the arena of legal and regulatory compliance.
Well, it's a real honor for us to have you on the show. And, Tom, if somebody is having a problem, how exactly do you help them? Do you go in and listen to what they're going through and give them suggestions on how to overcome the problem or try to detour the problems from happening? Or for our listeners out there, if somebody is thinking, I might have a compliance issue here, what do you exactly do for them to know how this kind of works?
Mary Ann, I styled myself early on as the nuts and bolts guy. When I started in independent practice in compliance, there were very few lawyers in private practice doing that. If they were in private practice, they generally did investigations or negotiated with the government. I'm not an ex-government lawyer, so I really don't think I'm the guy to sit across from the regulators. And if you have an incident and you need an investigation, unfortunately, you need bodies. And I'm a solo practitioner by design. So I decided to focus on building compliance programs. So typically I'm contacted by a company that either wants or needs a compliance program. And they're too small to have their own compliance function, sort of 50 to 500 million. Or, and this just happened yesterday, someone called me and said, we're revamping our code of conduct. Is that something you can help us with? So it's a discrete project that I would help people do. So I write policies and procedures. I do codes of conduct. I do training. I write incentives and disciplinary, or what the government calls consequence management. I help chief compliance officers staff and organize their compliance functions, all within the corporate framework.
Well, that's wonderful. And we have a lot of listeners that are CEOs, presidents of global companies, Tom. So I'm sure this podcast is going to be very helpful to them. Do you think that there's more need for this these days? I mean, unfortunately, we read the news, we watch television, we see so much about corruption going on. I would think that this is probably a situation or an area or issue that's more front and center now for most companies. Is that correct?
It's certainly front and center for Houston companies. And that's, of course, due to energy and lots of enforcement actions around corruption in energy companies. So lots of compliance in the city of Houston, lots of compliance in this part of Texas, the part of Texas we live in. But literally, if you're going to do business anywhere internationally, you have to have a compliance program in place. And that's fairly well understood. It's just now it moves to the matter of tweaking your program to make sure it's truly effective.
And Tom, why is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, such an important piece of legislation?
Mary Ann, that was the FCPA is the first international anti-corruption legislation literally in the history of the world. It was passed in 1977. The United States passed it. And the United States has led the world in this fight against the scourge of bribery and corruption. 9/11 showed us that crime leads to terrorism and terrorism leads to bribery and corruption. And 9/11, part of that was around corruption. So it became sort of a national security issue that we really need to stem the underlying causes of terrorism, and one of which is bribery and corruption. So it's on the radar of the national regulators of the Department of Justice. And that's made it even more important. But the second part, Mary Ann, is I mentioned Houston and energy specifically have had a large number of FCPA enforcement actions. All of those companies responded in a business way. They said, okay, this is the law. We're going to comply with it. But if you want to do business with us, you have to have a compliance program. So it's literally driven compliance all the way down the supply chain. And that's now happened in many industries. But the ones you and I are most familiar with because of where we practice is Houston. And in Houston, if you want to do business with an energy company, you have to have a compliance program in place. So it's a business to business solution now.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that people need to really be prepared to have a compliance policy in effect from day one. And if they don't have one, they better get one pretty quick. So tell us what some of the biggest issues companies face regarding ethics and compliance, Tom. I mean, is this something you can discuss or?
Oh, no. There's about 8 pillars to any compliance program. There's no trade secrets in compliance. Everybody knows what those pillars are. And it starts with tone at the top. Management has to set the right tone. And that's not just saying the right thing, it's doing the right thing. From there, you move to codes of conduct, policies and procedures, or internal controls, the true backbones of your compliance programs, the written component. And then you look at the chief compliance officer. Do they have the authority? Do they have the resources to actually put a program in place and run it? Then you must do a risk assessment to assess your risks of violation of the FCPA or other law. From there, you move to putting a program in place and then training on it, training and ongoing communications. Part of that compliance program, number 6, is financial incentives to do business ethically and in compliance, and what the Department of Justice would call consequence management. Then you move to the highest risk in a compliance program is third party. So you have to have a robust third party compliance program. And then finally, you monitor the results of your compliance program and approve as appropriate. So think of a continuous improvement wheel where you assess, design, implement, monitor, and improve as appropriate. There's some additional steps here and there in different types of compliance programs, but those are the basic 8 steps of every compliance program. And you go in and look and see if there any deficiency in any of those areas. So if you put a program in 10 years ago, I bet your risk have changed because you're doing business differently. Just think of COVID. Think of something as simple as working from home. That's a different level of risk, not more or less, just different. And then, of course, remote work or return to the office. All of those have different risk implications. So as your risks change, you need to adapt your compliance program to whatever your risks are.
No, I think that's really good information to know, Tom. And I think post-COVID, there are a lot of changes. I mean, on my side of the desk, I see a lot more people with the hybrid policies or working from home, or, you can have Monday and Friday off these days. But like you said, that's a good point. Working from home does cause different kinds of risks, and employers need to know about this. So the other thing that I'm just so impressed with about you is that you've helped so many people, me included, develop successful podcasts. I mean, I cannot tell you how meeting you and learning about podcasting and producing this show, it's opened up so many doors for me and introduced me to so many great people. But to us about why you think every business and or business professional needs a podcast.
Let me just tell the story, because to me, Mary Ann, it's a powerful story about obviously serendipity, but more than serendipity. And at the end of this podcast, I'm going to challenge you to do the same thing. And it's essentially this. We both attended a conference in Houston, did not know each other. I plopped down next to her. She was at the back table in a large conference room. We were going to hear a keynote, and I plopped down next to her. She had a couple of books in front of her. And so I started talking to you about your books. And we started talking, and I said, how about coming on a podcast and talk about it? And you said, what's a podcast? And it literally started there. And you came on and talked about your books, which is absolutely great. And then you saw the creation. It's not simply the podcast, but it's the creation of social media marketing assets that you can utilize in any way you deem appropriate, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And something sparked in you and said, I'm going to try this. And you did, to your eternal credit. And I guess what I would challenge you to is, the next conference you're at and you plop down next to somebody and you would say, would you come on my podcast? And here's why you need a podcast. Every business professional needs a podcast. And you and I are, I think, two of the best examples of, we have created our own brands. Now, you had a brand long before you met me, and I had a brand long before I met you. But those brands were enhanced by our podcasting. We demonstrated thought leadership. We demonstrated a communication style that I don't want to say was light and breezy, but people certainly relate to. We were able to put information out there that people can use, and people would contact us for our services if appropriate. So we have both been able to build our own unique brands. And that's something that every business professional carries with them wherever they go. Whether you call it the brand of you or the compliance evangelist or the voice of compliance or Ms. Career Can Do, whatever it may be, it's our brand. And I think that's so powerful in 2024. I guess now I have to say 20 years ago, we couldn't have done that. 10 years ago, maybe, but it's given people like us an ability, in my case, to literally have a worldwide compliance consulting practice out of my house because of the information I put out. And not only does every business professional need a podcast, I think every business needs a podcast. And so that's one of my soapbox speeches, which is why your business needs a podcast. Now, you've been able to combine those into two, the Mary Ann podcast and the business podcast, as much as I have. So you can build your own brand. You can build your company's brand. You can get the word out. You can talk to people. Open doors may not be open to you if you invite people to come on your podcast. I think it's just a fabulous way to communicate. And in my case, Mary Ann, I learn so much from the experts I talk to, and it's made me a better compliance professional.
Oh, I agree. It certainly made me. I love it because I learned so much from the people that I have on the show. But also, tell you my side of the story here. I sat down next to Tom. I didn't know Tom sat next to me. I was already there, and we started talking. And it was early 2020. It was just before the pandemic, and business wasn't booming. It was a little bit down. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this and see if this will help me expand my business model, expand my platform. And oh my goodness, it really has. All right. Faremouth has gotten so many clients from this podcast. I think it's also another way, obviously, to market what you do. You can reach people you couldn't reach before. All right. I agree with Tom. I love it because everyone I have on the show, I learned from, I establish relationships with. I have additional marketing available to me now, networking. And so I agree with Tom. I think a podcast is unbelievably a vehicle to help you grow your business and expand your business. And I think in times of change, we're all looking for innovative ways to expand that bottom line. And I certainly think, a podcast is certainly one of them. Tom, you had an interesting story about you had a situation that was a kind of a negative situation. I think you were riding a bike and fell off of it and had some time to think, just like I met Tom during COVID. Business wasn't booming, so I had some time to think. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's interesting, because people think, oh my God, this is so terrible. These terrible things can happen. But I think sometimes it's the darkness before the dawn. And sometimes you can be at a low point and think of a strategic thing like a podcast, and maybe it would really help turn your business around. I mean, talk to us a little bit about, if you don't mind, that situation with you that made you
Sure.
kind of do it.
So I did fall off a bike, but I was assisted by a Hummer, which ran into me. This was late 2009. Fortunately, my worst injury was a double fractured left leg. I was just really banged up internally, and it took forever to heal, just bruised internally, etc. Anyway, took a couple of months off to convalesce. I was charitably between jobs, I guess you would say, at the time. So I really wasn't working anyway. But when I finally had enough energy in 2010 to get in on my walker and toddle into my office, I realized I couldn't ride my bike anymore. So I was going to have to go back to work. And I thought about, what did I really want to do? Well, in my last corporate job, I had built out a compliance program for my company, and I really enjoyed that. So I thought, this is what I'm going to do. The lesson I learned, Mary Ann, is I'd always known when the universe closes one door, it opens another. But I didn't know until that time, and at that point I was 52, you have to have the courage to walk through that door. And because I literally had nothing to lose, because I had nothing, I had the courage. I wasn't going to lose anything by walking through that door. So I did. And the two best pieces of advice one woman said to me was, number one, don't be like every other lawyer I know. If you want to do this, that's fine. Just don't take every piece of work that comes in the door. Only take compliance work. So I turned down all other work. And number two was, you have to give it at least 6 months, but really a year. And just mentally commit, I'm going to do this for a year. And she was absolutely right. And 9 months later, I had a worldwide compliance practice literally out of the office of my house. This is 2010, long before work from home, when I couldn't leave the house except to go to physical therapy. I couldn't go have a drink, couldn't go to a conference, could never have met you again, couldn't have lunch, anything. And I built a worldwide practice at that time, literally just blogging. The podcasting came a few years later, but really the lesson I learned, and I try to impart, Mary Ann, is yes, bad things happen. Yes, there's the darkness, but there's going to be an opening and there's going to be light. And you just have to have the courage to walk through that. So I try to tell people, doesn't matter how far down you are, something's going to open up for you, and just walk through it and good things will happen. So,
yeah. Tom, that reminds me of a quote that I saw today in a magazine, and it didn't have a person that said it. It just was in there. And it said, turn a moment of fate into a lifetime of purpose. And I think that's what you've done. I think that's what I've done. I think that sometimes when we're in a situation where we're betwixt and between, we're maybe at a low point, sometimes that might be the beginning of something even more grandiose and huge to move through. And as you said, walk through that door and get to the other side, and also to help people with the lessons you've learned. I mean, I wrote a book about that, the lessons I've learned and how can I impart those lessons to somebody else. And I think, Tom, you do that. I mean, I was really, hesitant to start this podcast. I didn't, it was, I'm an introvert. I'm a friendly introvert, but I'm an introvert. My comfort zone is writing and research. All right. I mean, I can talk to anybody about anything, but I'm a little bit more, of a research kind of person. But this podcast has just opened up so many doors. The Compliance Podcast Network is global, and you've got so many people on there right now. If somebody's listening to this podcast, Tom, and they want to get a hold of you to investigate how you can either help them with their compliance issues or maybe get their own podcast, how would they do that?
Sure. They can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. They can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Thomas R. Fox on LinkedIn, and you can DM me. Or you can go to the Compliance Podcast Network, which is www.compliancepodcastnetwork.net. And there's a very cool tool called SpeakPipe, and you can leave me a voicemail, and I will contact you that way. So there's several different ways to reach out. I'm happy to chat with anyone about compliance, about podcasting, or about walking through that door when it opens.
I think that's wonderful. And I just think the world of Tom Fox, and I cannot be grateful enough for what he has helped me accomplish in my career. And we're getting near the end here of the podcast, Tom. And if we had to leave our listeners with 2 salient points about what we've talked about today, whether you want to talk about compliance or podcasting, what would those be?
Well, you are an introvert, and that's a fair assessment of you. But when you sit down at those conferences, talk to people, listen to people. If I hadn't sat down with you and you and I hadn't talked, we wouldn't be on this podcast today. And you never know what opportunity may come or how you may connect with a person who you literally didn't know 5 minutes before. And you and I have had a great professional relationship literally since February of 2020. So that's sort of number one. Number two is be endlessly curious. I mean, I am just amazed at not simply your curiosity, Mary Ann, but the quality of your output based upon your curiosity. You write, you podcast, you talk, and I'm endlessly curious too. And that's what's led me to love what I do as a podcaster. It's made me an exponentially better compliance professional. And I mentioned all of the books I've written. It's led directly to those books because I take that knowledge and repurpose it in the written format of a book. So never stop being curious.
Well, I think you've given our listeners some wonderful advice. I love your 2 salient points. All of this information will be on my website if you'd like to get a hold of Tom. He's an outstanding professional. I just can't say enough good things about him. Whether you have a compliance question, whether you're thinking about doing a podcast, give Tom a call. You won't be sorry, and you'll learn a lot in the process. So we're near the end here, and please listen to us. We're on all major podcast channels. We come out twice a month. We'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye. Thanks so much, Tom.
We thank you for tuning in to our Career Can Do podcast. We make no guarantees on results for your particular quest, but we hope you enjoy the information presented. The views and opinions expressed in this program are solely that of the guest or speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Mary Ann Faremouth and Faremouth & Company. Thank you.